A military commander stands at the edge of a high, steep incline. Below him stretches a massive skim. Flat, plain. The wind carries the terrifying sound. A commander who refused to trust God unless a woman held his hand and walked him onto the battlefield, on a flat plain, should still end in a massacre. For centuries, readers of this historical account have wondered how a militia of farmers and laborers actually broke the lines of a professional chariot force. The answer is not found in human strategy. To understand exactly what happened in the valley, and how the earth itself became the weapon that defeated Sisera, we have to look past the historical prose of chapter 4 and unlock the hidden details embedded in the poetry of chapter 5. 10,000 men swept down the wooded slopes of Mount Tabor. At the bottom of the incline, the Canaanite forces prepared to meet them. The ground vibrated under the weight of 900 iron chariots locking into formation. For a lightly armed infantry running toward an open plain, a slaughter seemed inevitable. But as Barak and his men reached the valley floor, the battle did not unfold through human military strategy. The prose account in Judges chapter 4 gives a very brief summary of the clash. It simply states that the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots with the edge of the sword. It tells us that God panicked the enemy, but it does not tell us how. To understand the hidden mechanics of this victory, we must turn the page to Judges chapter 5. And according to this common reading, God punishes his cowardice. Deborah tells him that because of his hesitation, this chapter contains the Song of Deborah and Barak, an ancient victory poem. In the biblical world, poetry was not merely artistic expression. It was a vault for historical memory, preserving the physical and sensory details of an event that the prose narrative left out. The Song of Deborah reveals that before the armies engaged, the sky tore open. Judges 5 describes a sudden, violent cosmological event. The earth trembled, and the heavens poured. The clouds indeed poured water. Then, the poem identifies the specific weapon God used to break the enemy lines. The torrent Kishon swept them away. The ancient torrent. The torrent Kishon. A flash flood in a matter of minutes. A torrential downpour hit the region. The dry, hard-packed trench of the Kishon River instantly burst its banks. The flat expanse of the Jezreel Valley, the perfect, solid terrain for high-speed chariot maneuvers, rapidly dissolved into a massive, inescapable swamp of thick mud. This is the profound irony of divine warfare. God did not provide the Israelites with better chariots. He did not give them heavier armor. He simply changed the environment. Suddenly, the 900 iron chariots were no longer an advantage. They were heavy, sinking metal coffins. The horses panicked, thrashing helplessly in the rising water. The iron-reinforced wheels buried themselves deep into the mud, paralyzing the Canaanite war machine. The ultimate glory of the battle will be stripped away from him and given to a woman. He will win the war, but he will lose his honor. The very weight that had made the enemy invincible became the exact mechanism of their destruction. Their insurmountable technological advantage became a trap. Into this paralyzed chaos, the lightning finally struck. Barak and his men descended upon a terrified, immobilized army. The Canaanite soldiers, weighed down by heavy armor and stuck in the mud, were entirely helpless against the fast-moving Israelite infantry. The massacre the Canaanites had planned was brutally reversed. The text records that the entire army of Sisera fell. Not a single man was left standing, except for one. In the chaos of the flooding valley, the commander of the Canaanite forces realized his iron chariot was useless. General Sisera abandoned his vehicle, left his dying men behind, and fled the battlefield on foot. He ran for miles, desperate for sanctuary, moving away from the carnage until he saw the isolated tents of a nomadic tribe. He knew this family had a peace treaty with his king. Exhausted, terrified, and covered in mud, the great general staggered toward the tent of a woman named Jael, and right behind him, tracking his path away from the river, came Barak. The Israelite commander was hunting his enemy. He had survived the impossible. He had won the war. and now he was pursuing the ultimate prize. It makes for a simple, moralistic sermon. Do not hesitate when God calls. Or, someone else will take your crown. But this interpretation contains a massive hidden contradiction. But, as Barak approached that lonely nomadic encampment, he was about to walk directly into the agonizing fulfillment of Deborah's prophecy. The great Canaanite general, who had commanded 900 iron chariots that morning, was now a terrified fugitive running on foot. He reached the tents of Heber the Kenite, a nomadic ally of his king. Standing at the door of her tent was a woman named Jael. She offered the exhausted commander sanctuary. Sisera collapsed inside the shadowed tent. He asked for a little water, but she opened a skin of milk, a thick, heavy drink, intended to induce sleep. She covered him with a heavy rug. As exhaustion overtook the general, the brutal reality of ancient warfare entered the quiet room. Jael did not have a sword. She reached for the familiar, everyday tools of a nomadic woman, a wooden tent peg and a heavy workman's hammer, moving silently to where he slept. She drove the peg squarely through his temple and into the ground. The terror of Israel was dead, pinned to the dirt by a woman. Moments later, Barak arrived at the encampment. He was breathless, carrying the violent momentum of the battlefield. He had shattered the Canaanite army. He had done the impossible. If Barak's demand was truly a sin of cowardice, if his hesitation was a failure of belief that disqualified him from greatness, now he only needed one final strike to secure his eternal legacy. But Jael stepped out of her tent to meet him. She did not bow to a conquering hero. She simply looked at the general and said, "Come, and I will show you the man whom you are seeking." Barak pulled back the heavy fabric of the tent and stepped inside. There lay General Sisera, lifeless and bleeding at the feet of a woman. In that silent, shocking moment, the prophecy of Deborah was perfectly fulfilled. Barak's ultimate military trophy was gone. He had led the men. He had risked the massacre. He had charged down the mountain. But his kavod, his personal glory, had been handed to a woman who had never even stepped onto the battlefield. In the ancient world, this was a moment designed to produce bitter humiliation. A fragile ego would have erupted in anger. A proud military commander would have minimized Jael's action, silenced the witnesses, or claimed he had mortally wounded Sisera during the flood. But Barak does something entirely unexpected. Turn the page to Judges chapter 5. The text reads, "On that day Deborah and Barak, son of Abinoam, sang this song. Barak does not hide in shame. He does not complain about his lost glory." We have to explain what happens thousands of years later in the New Testament. In the 11th chapter of the book of Hebrews, he stands beside the prophetess and literally sings a song of praise that elevates Jael above himself. He joins his voice in declaring, "Most blessed of women be Jael." He celebrates a victory that bears another person's name. Barak proves that his hesitation in the beginning was never about cowardice. It was about a genuine desire for God's presence. And because he had God's presence, he did not need the applause of men. The oppression of his people was over. And for Barak, that was enough. He was perfectly content to share the leadership and surrender the spotlight. Barak walked away from the battlefield with no trophy. For centuries, readers looked at his empty hands and concluded that he was a compromised, secondary figure, a man who missed his chance at absolute greatness because he lacked independent courage. But thousands of years later, a New Testament writer looks back at the mud of the Kishon River and the silent tent of Jael, and when that writer evaluates the legacy of Barak, he sees something entirely different. The writer of the book of Hebrews possessed the exact same history scrolls as everyone else. He knew the story of the hesitation on Mount Tabor. The writer constructs a magnificent monument to biblical heroes, the ultimate hall of faith. It is a curated list of men and women. He knew about the uncomfortable ultimatum given to a female prophet. He knew about the lost military glory, the mud of the Jezreel Valley, and the brutal conclusion inside a nomadic tent. Yet, when this first-century author sits down to compile the ultimate registry of biblical heroes, the famous Hall of Faith in Hebrews chapter 11, he looks past generations of powerful kings and self-sufficient warriors He dips his pen and deliberately writes the name of Barak. He places a general with no final trophy alongside David, Samuel, and Moses. Why? Because the book of Hebrews fundamentally redefines what true faith actually looks like. We often assume that biblical faith means reckless independence. We think a hero is someone who charges into the darkness alone, feeling no fear, needing no help, and trusting only in their own isolated strength. We equate spiritual greatness with solitary, unbroken bravery. We want our heroes to be the ones who strike the final blow, stand over the fallen enemy, and absorb the applause of the crowd. But the inclusion of Barak completely shatters that modern definition. Barak is enshrined in the Hall of Faith, not in spite of his hesitation, but because of what his hesitation represented. His greatness was found in his profound awareness of his own limitations. He knew that leading an army of lightly armed men into a valley, who redefined history through their radical trust in God. The writer lists Abraham, who left his homeland. He lists Moses, who split the sea, of iron chariots. Without the prophetic guarantee of God's presence was not an act of faith. It was an act of foolish, suicidal pride. The New Testament does not require flawless, independent courage for entry into the Hall of Faith. It requires a heart that absolutely refuses to step onto a battlefield without God. Barak's faith was not demonstrated by how quickly he drew his sword. His faith was demonstrated by his willingness to look at Deborah and say, "If you do not go with me, I will not go." He was willing to endure the cultural accusation of cowardice. He was willing to share the leadership in a fiercely patriarchal society. And most importantly, he was willing to permanently surrender his own military glory, all to ensure that he did not move forward without the presence of God. This upends how we measure spiritual success. Human culture praises the independent hero, the visionary who needs no one, who takes all the credit, and who stands entirely alone at the summit of victory. But the biblical portrait of Barak celebrates interdependent, shared leadership. He needed Deborah to confirm the voice of God. He needed Jael to finish the war. He was a piece of a larger, divinely orchestrated puzzle, and he was completely content with his place in it. He did not need to be the only hero in the story. And then, in verse 30-20, he adds another name. He writes, "And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon." The historical mystery of Hebrews chapter 11 is answered. The general who surrendered his glory on earth was handed an eternal legacy in the New Testament. But as the historical dust settles over the Kishon River, the implications of this ancient story become deeply confrontational. If Barak's legacy was secured by his surrender of control, and if his faith was defined by his refusal to act independently, we are forced to ask a difficult question about our own battles. To understand what this means for us today, we must ask what we are currently refusing to release. When we step back and look at the complete arc of this history, the biblical portrait of Barak is not what we originally assumed. He is not a weak man who reluctantly stumbled into a victory. He is a masterclass in spiritual maturity. The story of the Kishon River compresses into three profound truths that confront our modern obsession with success. First, true faith is not independent bravery. It is radical, uncompromising dependence. Second, needing the spiritual strength of others, sharing the leadership in a crisis is not a sign of weakness, but of wisdom. And finally, surrendering the need to be the hero of your own story is the only way to genuinely follow the presence of God. This brings the historical narrative directly into our own lives. What is the battle you are currently trying to fight alone simply to prove your own strength? Barak, Samson and Jephthah. About David and Samuel and the prophets. Barak is enshrined forever alongside David and Moses, not as a coward. What are the iron chariots in your life? The impossible pressures, the deeply entrenched habits, the overwhelming responsibilities that you are charging toward without asking for help? In our careers, our families, and even our faith, we are constantly pressured to project the image of the solitary hero. We are told to hide our hesitation. We are told that asking for a partner or refusing to move until God makes his presence clear, is a sign of insecurity. But the story of Barak gives you permission to lay down the exhausting burden of independent glory. You do not have to have all the answers before you step onto the battlefield. You do not have to strike the final blow. You are allowed to need the spiritual fire of a Deborah in your life. You are allowed to celebrate the victory of a Jael, even when it means your own name is not in the spotlight. The pressure to secure your own legacy is a heavy, unnecessary armor. You can take it off. We return, finally, to the image where we began. A military commander stands at the edge of Mount Tabor, looking down into a terrifying valley. At the beginning of this story, that mountain looked like a place of fear, the place where a general hesitated and stalled. But now, we see that mountain for what it truly was. It was a place of holy restraint. It was the launching pad of a man, of an ancient superweapon, the metallic clatter and rumbling thunder of 900 iron chariots moving across the valley floor, not as a compromised, secondary figure, but as a giant of the faith. The problem is not that the book of Judges is unclear, who decided that stepping off the edge without God was far more dangerous than facing 900 chariots of iron. Barak lost his military trophy. He lost the immediate applause of the ancient world, but he gained a permanent place in the eternal architecture of Scripture. He teaches us that true victory is not standing alone over a defeated enemy. It is walking down the mountain in the presence of God, perfectly content to let him distribute the honor. If this study helped you see the story of Barak and the nature of biblical faith more clearly, consider subscribing to the channel. Share this video with someone who feels the pressure of fighting their battles alone. And let me know in the comments what biblical story we should investigate next. The problem is that we have fundamentally misunderstood what Barak was actually asking for. The central question is this: why does the New Testament celebrate a military commander whose defining biblical moment looks like an act of hesitation? If faith is supposed to be bold and independent, why is the only judge who refused to act alone placed in the Hall of Faith? This is not ultimately a story about a man losing his glory as a punishment. It is a story about a man who decided that God's presence was more valuable than his own reputation. To understand why Barak's hesitation was actually an act of profound spiritual intelligence, we cannot just read the text from the safety of a modern armchair. We have to step onto the slopes of Mount Tabor. We have to look down at the valley of Jezreel, strip away our modern assumptions, and understand exactly what Barak was being commanded to face. For 20 years, the nation of Israel had been suffocating under the brutal control of a Canaanite king named Jabin. His power was not enforced by diplomacy or economic pressure. It was enforced by his commanding general, Sisera, and an absolute, terrifying technological advantage. He has just received a direct command from God to march down this mountain and engage the enemy. But he refuses to take a single step forward alone. 900 chariots of iron. To the ancient mind, an iron chariot was not simply a mode of transportation. It was the ultimate superweapon. Picture a heavy, fast-moving platform, often reinforced with iron fittings and designed to carry elite archers and spearmen. It was the ancient equivalent of an armored tank, built to break infantry lines, trample soldiers, and spread psychological terror through the sheer volume of its noise and speed. Against this military machine, Israel had virtually nothing. The poetic account of the battle, recorded one chapter later, reveals the desperate reality of the Israelite resistance. It states that not a shield or spear was seen among 40,000 in Israel. They had no standing army. They had no heavy armor. They were a loose confederation of oppressed tribes, armed with slings, wooden clubs, and agricultural tools. But the technological mismatch was only half of the problem. The true nightmare was the geography. The Canaanite forces dominated the Jezreel Valley, a massive, flat expanse of land perfectly suited for chariot warfare. Iron chariots are useless in the rocky highlands, but on an open plain, they are virtually invincible. When Deborah the prophetess summons Barak, she tells him to gather 10,000 men and march to Mount Tabor. Mount Tabor is a steep, dome-shaped mountain, rising abruptly out of the flat valley floor. As long as Barak keeps his men on the mountain, they are completely safe. His name is Barak, and, for thousands of years, history has not been kind to him. When most readers open the 4th chapter of the book of Judges, chariots cannot climb the wooded slopes. But the divine command does not stop there. Deborah tells Barak that God will draw Sisera's chariots to the Kishon River at the bottom of the valley, and Barak must go down to meet them. He is being ordered to abandon the high ground, to walk a lightly armed, untrained infantry onto a flat plain against a charging armored cavalry is not a difficult battle. It is tactical suicide. It is a massacre. When we understand the military reality of the Jezreel Valley, Barak's famous hesitation suddenly looks very different. He is not a fragile coward shrinking from a fair fight. He is a seasoned military commander staring at a death sentence. He knows that human strategy cannot survive in that valley. The math does not work. This makes his response to Deborah entirely logical. He is weighing the cost of 10,000 lives against an impossible command. But it also creates a deeper mystery. If Barak is refusing to move because the military odds are suicidal, how does Deborah's physical presence solve the problem? Bringing a female judge to a battlefield does not give the Israelites iron weapons. It does not change the geography. It does not stop a charging chariot. If this was merely about military strategy, her presence would be useless. But Barak was not asking for tactical support. They see a cautionary tale. They see a reluctant, fearful leader who lacks the courage to do what God has asked. He was demanding something far more powerful. To understand exactly what Barak was requiring before he would step off the mountain, we have to look closely at the Hebrew meaning of his name and the specific identity of the woman standing in front of him. A man named after a storm refuses to strike. In Hebrew, the name Barak means lightning. It is a name that implies sudden, explosive, unstoppable movement. It is the perfect title for a military commander tasked with sweeping down a mountain. Yet, standing on the edge of the Jezreel Valley, the lightning is stalled. He will not move. To understand why, we must look at the woman standing beside him. When the text introduces Deborah in Judges chapter 4, she is given a specific Hebrew description, Eshet Lapidot. Most English Bibles translate this simply as the wife of Lapidoth, assuming it is the name of her husband, but the translation can carry a broader nuance. The Hebrew word lapidot literally translates to torches or flames. Because of this, many scholars understand the phrase not merely as a marital status, but as a description of her character and calling. She is a woman of fire. She is a prophetess, illuminating the darkness of Israel's oppression with the blazing truth of God's word. The prophetess Deborah summons him and delivers a clear set of orders. Gather 10,000 men. March to Mount Tabor. We have a commander named Lightning and a prophetess of fire. When Barak says to her, "If you will go with me, I will go," he is not asking for emotional comfort from a mother figure. He is acting on a deeply ingrained, ancient reality. In the biblical world, a prophet was not merely an advisor. The prophet was the physical, tangible embodiment of the word and presence of God. Barak is staring at a valley of iron chariots. He knows that his military strategy is suicidal. His only chance of survival is if God actually intends to fight for him. By demanding Deborah's presence, Barak is tethering himself entirely to the divine promise. He is effectively saying, "I am the lightning mine, but you carry the fire of God's presence. I will not lead 10,000 men into a massacre on a presumption. If the presence of God does not go with me, I will not step off this mountain." This is not cowardice. This is profound spiritual clarity. Barak understands the difference between human courage and divine mandate. He refuses to cross the line between faith and foolish independence. Deborah immediately recognizes the weight of his request. She agrees to accompany him. "I will surely go with you," she says. But the presence of God often demands a surrender of human pride, and God will draw the enemy general, Sisera, into a trap. But Barak's response is one of the most infamous ultimatums in biblical history. Deborah delivers a sharp prophetic condition that will alter Barak's legacy forever. However, she warns him, "There will be no glory for you in the course you are taking, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman." In the ancient Near East, military glory was the ultimate currency of a man's life. To defeat an enemy commander was to secure your name in history. It meant wealth, prestige, and eternal honor. Deborah tells Barak that he will win the war, but the crown of that victory, the final defeat of Sisera, will be taken from him. The ultimate credit will go to a woman. This is the central test of his motivation. Will the lightning strike if no one praises the storm? Barak is forced to make a decision. He can refuse the terms, keep his pride intact, and stay off the battlefield. Or he can accept the loss of his glory in exchange for the presence of God. He accepts the terms. He gathers his men, and with the prophetess beside him, he ascends Mount Tabor, waiting for the iron chariots to assemble below. But when the moment of truth arrives, it is not Barak's strategy that wins the war. It is the very earth beneath their feet. The earth beneath their feet in the Jezreel Valley was dominated by the Kishon River, a seasonal watercourse. He looks at Deborah and says, "If you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go." That, for most of the year, was nothing more than a dry, hard-packed trench to General Sisera. This solid ground was the ultimate tactical advantage. He deployed his 900 iron chariots along the valley floor, forming an impenetrable, terrifying wall of metal. He was waiting for the Israelites to make a mistake. High above on Mount Tabor, Barak watched the Canaanite forces assemble. He was a commander staring at the fight of his life, but he was carrying a unique psychological burden. He was walking into this battle knowing that the greatest prize had already been forfeited. To understand the sheer magnitude of what Barak surrendered, we have to understand the ancient economy of honor. In the biblical world, a man's identity was entirely bound to the concept of honor and shame. The Hebrew word for glory is kavod, which literally translates to weight or heaviness. Your glory was your cultural weight. It was your legacy. In military terms, the ultimate kavod was secured by defeating the enemy commander, taking the life, the weapons, and the armor of a general like Sisera was the pinnacle of human achievement. It would guarantee a man's name would be spoken with reverence for generations. It was the ancient equivalent of immortality. But Barak had traded his kavod for the presence of God. He had accepted Deborah's prophecy. The Lord would sell Sisera into the hands of a woman. The familiar interpretation of this moment is harsh. Barak is viewed as a weak man demanding a safety net. Barak was paying the ultimate price of prophetic presence. He was willing to do the brutal, terrifying work of leading 10,000 men into a valley of iron, knowing full well that history would view him as a secondary character in his own victory. He was choosing to be the mechanism of deliverance rather than the hero of the story. This is the moment his hesitation ends. The Book of Judges records that as the iron chariots lock into formation below, Deborah turns to Barak and issues a single, explosive command. "Up, for this is the day in which the Lord has given Sisera into your hand. Does not the Lord go out before you?" Notice the framing of her question. She does not tell him that his strategy is brilliant. She does not tell him that his men are strong enough to break the iron lines. She simply confirms the one thing he had demanded from the very beginning. The presence of God is moving ahead of him. For Barak, that is enough. The man whose name means lightning, finally, lives up to his identity. Judges 4:14 describes the sudden, dramatic shift. So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. He abandons the safety of the high ground. He leads a lightly armed infantry straight down the wooded slopes and charges directly at the terrifying Canaanite war machine. It is a moment of breathtaking courage. But courage alone does not destroy iron. An infantry charging an armored cavalry